Wow. So we did it.
We did it.
We actually put this thing together. This was an ambitious project from the very beginning. And we're here. And if you're listening to this, we've launched.
Yeah, we've launched. Who knows how it's doing? Hopefully very well, Mike.
And you're saying that because we're having to record this a few days before launch because we made the decision to actually put out the entire first story on the first day, followed very quickly by the second story. And so after each individual story, which consists of 2 parts, we're going to have a little after show like this, where we actually talk about the behind the scenes and our process for how we put this episode together. And there was no shortage of work here.
No, there wasn't. It was nonstop for months and months and months, but it was super enjoyable and definitely different than anything I've ever done in my entire life. It was a wild ride, man. Still is.
It is different. That is for sure. And one of the things I did want to talk about is how it is different and how it's different from both your show, Dark Topic, and my show, Sword and Scale.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, when you sent me your first draft of Armin right in the beginning there. And I remember listening to it and getting back to you and saying, wow, this is the best thing I ever heard. And that's not blowing smoke. I still feel that way about it. Both of us have this storytelling vibe that we're trying to be almost similar to like a Robert Stack from Unsolved Mysteries or a Rod Serling from The Twilight Zone. And that's why we work so well together, I think. But what you did here, right off the get-go, what I caught was like, man, this guy's telling a bedtime story, almost, you know?
Yeah.
It's really lulling me into it. I'm not falling asleep, that's for sure. But I mean, I'm really getting sucked into this. It's immersive.
Yeah, and that's the one thing I really wanted to be able to create. It's a little challenging to be able to put a listener into this world and get them to create the images of what it looks like in their own mind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're doing their part as well with their imagination. And that's what any good book will do for you, right? And in the past, radio shows and all that, and podcasts too. But like you said, it's almost like a movie play going through your mind. And what really struck me is that when I first heard it, I was like, I've been searching for this. I didn't know I was searching for this, but I've been searching for this. Like an immersive true crime podcast that puts you in the shoes not only of the victims, but of the killer themselves, and unapologetically explores the world through their eyes, you know, and that sounds risky. It sounds like something that would be off-putting, and it is, of course, at times, but it's not in the spirit of justifying the crimes. Like I've said before, it's in the spirit of explaining as best we can how we imagine these killers came to be. You know, there's a whole new perspective when you stop being outraged and just try to understand. And that's a risk that we're taking here, and I think it will pay off.
My name is Evan Ziegelman.
This is Evan.
I am a producer at Incongruity Media.
Months before Jack Luna became involved in Monstro, we were already busy at work imagining what this new show could be.
Monstro was different from Sword and Scale because it's a singular focus. Sword and Scale comes at the story from multiple different angles and gives you all the details. Monstro approaches it from the mindset of the killer. You're in the killer's shoes. You step into their life, their hometown. You're living in their home. You're growing up with them. And then you're also reliving some of the most gruesome acts of humanity.
At first, I didn't know exactly how he would pull this off. I just knew we wanted to create something unlike anything we'd ever heard before. We wanted to create a podcast that we wanted to hear.
When Mike first approached me about this, my first thought was, whatever you want, boss, I'll do it. But once I actually started getting into it, I was a little hesitant just because of how, sick and twisted some of this subject matter can be. And, sometimes I found myself a little lost down the rabbit hole, as we say. So I think as much of a part of Armin that I became, or as much of a part of me that Armin became, you can sense that through the storytelling. In the beginning, we wanted to pick some of the most disturbing stories that we could find. And there's a lot that we can't share on Sword and Scale because Sword and Scale is clip-based. So we took these stories usually from the far corners of the earth. We couldn't share those either due to the language barrier or due to the lack of audio, or due to the age of the story. And we wanted to share these, so we had to recreate what happened without the aid of existing audio. To develop an immersive scene, I wanted to be able to give the audience everything that's going on. Not just your typical, narration of inside the mind of the character, but I also took the sights and the sounds and the harder to convey smells even. For instance, the train scene in the beginning when we're introducing Bernd, the trains coming in from a distance. As we're describing the similarities in color between the gray sky and the silver train, the sound starts to build in the background of the train wheels and the engine. And then you hear the hiss of the brakes. And before you realize it, you're in the episode. You're standing next to Bernd on the track waiting for that 9 o'clock train to Castle. That's what I enjoy about this show, is that it's so immersive because of the layers of audio and music, and you're not listening to it, you're feeling it, you're living it. So every time I found myself in a place with this character, I'd ask myself, what do you see? What do you smell? What do you feel? Is it cold? Is there a taste in the air? Those little details really pull in the listener. Those little details create the story.
So in Monstro, we told stories from vastly different parts of the world, stories that really didn't have a lot of available audio, and that was a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, it was, but it ended up being a strength for us because without having some of the information that gave us where it was left available for us to fill in those spaces on our own, make a good guess at it, right? An educated guess with what we had. And, this particular story, there really wasn't all that much. And you didn't need it. What we needed to know was that he had a farmhouse, he had access to the internet. His parents had passed away and he was close to them. And then he wanted to eat a man. And from there, you have him sitting there cracking bottles of wine and setting the mood and all that kind of stuff. And his anticipation leading up to what was actually going to go on. It kind of wrote itself. It's a great story. It's amazing. I always thought that I needed boatloads of information to be able to create an episode for my podcast. Turns out you just need enough. You need to know what the crime was. You need to know a little bit of background information and how it finished, and you could do the rest. That's what we've done. And
this first episode about Armin is much more graphic than a lot of the rest of the series.
Yes.
It's a real punch in the gut.
Yeah. Like I said, I didn't write this, nor did Tyler Bell, who the two of us ended up writing almost all the other episodes. And, let's be honest, this is very homoerotic at times,
Yeah.
It's like, and I can't take any credit for that, unfortunately. I'm a huge fan of a homoerotic fiction.
That's what I hear. Yeah.
I just, I'm glad I didn't have to put my spin on this one. Like with Tyler and I, we've worked together quite a bit. When I walk into the rooms that he's created, the rooms of which it's my part to adjust, accentuate, or tidy up, it's always familiar. But with what you guys did with Armin, I would have walked in and been like, what the fuck are you guys doing in here? Why are there dicks all over the room? Like, this is fucking madness. This is crazy. It's just, and I'm not homophobic. Don't get me wrong. I actually grew up around a lot of gay people, but that's a lot of homoerotica going on in this story, man. It's wild. And I didn't have to turn it off for that reason. I had to turn it off just for how, like you said, how graphic it is. Like chewing somebody's penis off with your teeth. Like, holy fuck, dude. Or trying to. Woo.
One of the challenges that I had, because I did a lot of the editing of this one.
Right.
And like you said, Evan wrote the majority of it. But there was a lot of editing that had to occur because when I got it, there were so many different ways that the word penis was described.
Right.
that it started to feel almost comical in a way.
Right.
Even though there's nothing really funny about this story. Mm-hmm. But it got to that point where, there's only so many ways you can describe a dick.
Yeah.
And they were all in this story originally, and it just started to feel a like inappropriately comical.
Yeah.
Just because I guess dicks are funny, but
yeah.
not when you cut them off your victim and eat them, I guess.
and burn them, and they look like a friggin' overcooked hot dog and all that stuff. I'm glad we didn't go too far that way.
So my fiance's a chef, and I asked her, how do you cook steak? Specifically, if I wanted to cook, I don't know, a bull penis. And she said it would be really sinewy. And I said, I'm stealing that word. And it's in the episode, sinewy. Google it if you don't know what that means. It just means chewy as all get out. So, so there's those situations where I'm not a good cook. I like to dabble. I would try to convince someone coming over to my house that I am a good cook. But imagining cooking human flesh, let alone a phallus, that was difficult. So basically, I tried to imagine something else and then describe it in a horrible way. So, I mean, but if you think about it, cooking any slab of meat is kind of gross. So you can, I mean, if you just put your mind into that set, the blood and the flesh and it's primeval, burning and cooking flesh. I don't know. So you've heard the term. It's so unbelievable. It's got to be true. I didn't make that up. That's actually the meal. He had the Princess Croquette potatoes, which is apparently a popular way to prepare it in Europe. I had to look up, exactly what that is, and it just seems like regular potatoes to me. So I just imagined, this guy lives alone. He's got a giant house. He's lonely. He goes in the kitchen. He cooks a meal all for himself, and he sets the table, and he sets the table for one with the best dinnerware. I imagined, like when you're alone and you're stuck in that repetition, that grind that he had at that point in his life. Get up, go to work, come home, see the neighbors, go home, go to bed, wake up, do it all over again. That, you probably cope with that loneliness in some strange ways. And extravagant dinner parties by himself is one of them.
When you look at this story, the way that we did from Armin's warped perspective, suddenly you have a coming-of-age tale, like a love story, almost. These two, in a strange way, were soulmates, not based on love, but based on what their fantasies were, And yes, we could explain from a bird's eye view what went down in that farmhouse and have a pretty compelling episode. But like I already said, sitting at the table with Armin as he sets the table, lights a candle, and corks the wine, really drives home how normal he was, but how, oh man, his fantasies were way out there. And there's probably very few Armin Mavises out there in the world, you'd think, right?
Well, there's probably very few of either of these characters, and that,
Right.
and I like what you said about it being sort of almost a just tragic love story, because it's true. I mean, these two people, there's probably only one of them in the entire history of the universe, and they found each other through the internet. One who wants to eat someone and one who wants to be eaten. I mean, what are the odds?
What are the odds? Very low. I mean, yeah. I mean, a lot of them that he was reaching out to online, they just had the fantasy part of it. They weren't actually going to go through with it. But, Byrne was willing to go. And, at some point, you almost start to wish them all the best. You crazy kids, go for it. Do you? Grab life by the balls or, well, I mean, you're doing it with your teeth there, buddy. Relax. But whatever makes them happy, that's how I felt. I don't know if a lot of people will feel that way, but I had no problem with it. They were both into it.
As messed up as it sounds, I look back on it now and I kind of think about him fondly. I mean, sure, he ate a guy, but if you watched and read as much about him as I did preparing to write this episode, especially his post-incarceration interview, I don't know, he's just a likable guy. I mean, he's a little creepy. I mean, especially if you know what he did. But I wanted to portray him that way because I thought it was a little more disturbing to the listener. By the time you get to the end and you find out exactly what he's been planning on doing and how he goes about doing it, it's disgusting in its own right. But at that point in the story, you've almost developed a sympathy for him, his loneliness. Burned, on the other hand, is not a sympathetic character. there's a line in the story where he says he's accustomed to lying, and he covers up the fact that he's leaving and going to be with Armin. His subversive lifestyle was hidden from everyone he knew. So by the time you meet him and he's running away from his dad, his boyfriend, his career, essentially disappearing, he's not a very likable character, even though he's the victim, and he might, in a typical story arc, that would be the sympathetic character.
I'm glad you said that, because I was about to ask you, like, how do you feel about, let's say, Armin, who is, I mean, technically the killer here? Do you feel empathy for him at some point?
I don't. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I feel empathy for him, but I just feel the same way I feel like anybody who has any different fantasies than I do. Like, I'm not a homosexual, but I don't care if you like men or if you like women. I really don't care. If you're into eating people and you're into being eaten, go nuts. I mean, why is it any of my business? They were both willing participants, That is truly my opinion.
So I take it you see this more as assisted suicide than murder.
I don't think that Byrne was even real. I mean, I don't even know if he really wanted to. I guess he wanted to die. It's not so much he wanted to die. He wanted the experience, the most intense possible sexual experience that he could possibly have. And the most intense just so happened to include him having to die. So I think his fantasy was assisted more so than his suicide, to be honest.
You watch those sci-fi movies with dystopian futures, and there's societies like the society he belongs to, and that's where maybe it's okay if somebody gave him permission. How do I feel about it? It's certainly disturbing, and I think that's the worst part. Is where does he go from there? From my basic research about criminal minds, it always escalates. And so I imagine eventually his one rule of willing participants would be broken. And even in the story, he starts running out of Byrne way before he thought he would. And immediately starts trolling the internet looking for, new participants. If he couldn't find one, the next step is an unwilling participant.
It's a very interesting case, man.
It is. It is one that makes you wonder how you really feel about how far you go with being tolerant of some of the fantasies of others in your own mind, and as a society, how far should we go to be accepting of someone else's fantasies when it can result in an ending like this?
Yeah. Again, if Byrne's okay with it, I'm okay with it.
I didn't touch on the legality of it very much in this story because it's not really what it's about. But that's the big question you're left with, is this was a willing participant. I mean, in the United States, we had, Dr. Kevorkian. This was assisted suicide, basically. Sure, he did it in the most bizarre and macabre way possible, hanging him from the ceiling and quartering him like any other animal you lead to slaughter. He murdered with permission. And they actually had to change the law in Germany just to be able to, put this guy in jail. So, he was originally only sentenced to 8 years in prison on some, bogus charge they could come up with, or the best charge they could come up with was like manslaughter or something like that. But they ended up changing it, and so while technically gross, cannibalism's not illegal, and there's no laws against it, at least not in Germany. So they ended up changing the law just to be able to put him away for life, and that's where he is now.
And who knows what he was thinking once his penis was cut off and he was bleeding out. Now maybe he was just afraid. We don't know, right? And that would be a shame. Armin puts him out of his misery by, sticking a knife into his throat and all that. So if he wanted to go that exact way, we're not sure either. So he signed up for it, though. He showed up. He came to Armin,
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I don't know. Interesting.
Well, I think that's going to do it for this one. And we'll see you here again in just one day.
One day.
For the next story.
Yeah. Hit you right in the mouth. Bam, bam. Enjoy.
We'll see you there. Monstro is an Incongruity Media production. The original soundtrack to Monstro is available on iTunes, Apple Music, Amazon, Google Play, Spotify, and just about everywhere else you listen to music. Merch, such as t-shirts, tank tops, and caps, can be ordered at monstropodcast.com. If you like the show, please subscribe and leave us a positive review.